how in the world our young people ever got captured by the idea that the proper way to go about transforming the world in a positive way is to wander around outside with signs on sticks and make noise. I mean, people are really, it's such a strange idea. It's like a medieval dance of some sort. It's so distant from reality, the idea that that's the way that you can change complex systems for the better. But we have entire disciplines continually promoting the idea that social activism is the highest form of human activity. And it's pseudo activity. It looks like effort, but it isn't. It looks productive, but it isn't.
I think you're leaving, to be fair, I think you're leaving out the black masks and the car burning, which I think really the pièce de résistance of effective dialogue.
Yes. Yeah, well, that also, that the darker end of that allows people to revel in their resentment while simultaneously telling themselves a story about how virtuous they are.
Right.
It's really it's absolutely appalling behavior.
And the anonymity that doing it at night and with the black masks, it's all Kafkaesque.
I figured out how to never have protesters at my talks. It's real easy. I'd recommend this. Hey, all you social conservative types that are listening, always schedule your talk early in the morning. Because the protesters, they're late night creatures, and they're hungover and useless to get the hell out of bed. So
that's good.
If you have your talk at 8 in the morning, no protesters will ever show up. They don't roll out of bed till 2, and they're not even organized to go out and protest until 5. So
that's
it's
good.
Really comical. I suggested to the university when we did the debate there that we have it in the morning for exactly that reason. We had one government elected member show up to distribute a few pamphlets, and that was it for protests.
Well, let's go from anonymous to disclosure and talk about the self-authoring suite. I've begun the writing of it. I started at the present, and present virtue because I'm a chicken. I didn't want to go too gnarly because I frankly, even writing so kind of openly, I mean, as a Catholic, it felt like a written confession without absolution. But just the act of disclosing things about even something positive, and I think the virtue I'm working on now is comfortable being the center of attention. And I began to think about why you or the way it's been developed is describe that as a virtue, because growing up, that was always thrown back at me as, oh, you're just the class clown. You've got to always be on, and that's hardly a virtue. But it is in a way. I could not do any communicating. I couldn't speak in front of a large crowd. I couldn't be sitting here if I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. So now I've just changed my mind about that, and I'm really just at the beginning of it. Yeah.
Glad to hear
now, I want to get into the data. I want to talk about the 85 students at McGill and your work with James Pennebaker and Rotterdam research, because data like that gets my attention. But how did the idea of writing down your past, present, and future, and almost you're editing yourself too, aren't you? As you recall things, you're filtering the event, and then there's the remembering of the event, and it's hard to kind of separate them out. How did this arise? How did this idea begin?
Well, it had two sources conceptually. I mean, I've been working on the idea that people's perceptual frames are basically have the structure of stories for a very long time. And so you look at the world through a lens, and the lens, if you describe that lens to someone else, you're basically telling them a story. And people really like listening to stories because we like the opportunity to have multiple lenses because they each serve a different function, which is partly why it's so useful to listen to people who don't agree with you, because they might tell you something you don't know that you can then use. So if you talk to people who agree with you, you just hear the same old thing all the time.
Yeah.
So one source was the observation that people inhabit stories and find them valuable. And so it's a psychoanalytic idea in part that you act out the story of your life, something like that. So you need to know what your story is. And this is something that Carl Jung stressed particularly, because he said if you don't know what your story is, there's always the possibility that it's a tragedy and that you're the fool. So you don't have the option of not being in the story. Mm-hmm. You have the option of determining in part what that story will be. So you can be the hero of your own story, we might say, or a bit player in someone else's story. And you're not going to get a very good part if you pick bit player in someone else's drama. Now, you can forfeit responsibility if you do that, so it has some advantages. All right, so then the next piece of the puzzle was James Pennebaker's work, and he's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And Pennebaker was interested in testing Freud's theory. So Freud had this theory that if bad things happened to you when you were young, that might have a determining effect on your personality, and that you were likely to repress those events to the detriment of your well-being. Freud believed that if you brought those events forward and discussed them, that would produce an emotional response that he called catharsis. It would often be accompanied, say, by tears, and that catharsis released the emotional pressure associated with the events and was curative. And so Pennebaker decided to. Now, there's something about that that's true, even though I think Freud's formulation was flawed. A flawed formulation that moves you in the right direction is a lot better than no formulation at all. Okay, so Pennebaker decided to put this to the test. And so what he did was bring university students in and had them write 15 minutes a day, 3 days in a row, about the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And a control group just wrote about the things they did that day. And what Pennebaker found was that over a multi-month follow-up period, the students who engaged in that, call it expressive writing, because he was working on the catharsis model at that time, their health improved. They visited the doctor less frequently. And Pennebaker was very curious about why that occurred. And so he went back into the writings of those whose health had improved the most and coded the words they used. And he coded words for emotional expression, so that would be the catharsis hypothesis. But he also coded them for indications of cognitive transformation, like, well, I now realize, or I've come to understand, or that I now know, or I can now see. And what he found was the emotional words didn't predict improvement, but the cognitive words did. And so his hypothesis was that the reformulation of a traumatic or uncertain event into an understood sequence reduced the overall stress load on the person. So a way of thinking about that is, imagine that your brain is trying to compute how stressed you should be. And it wants to make you as stressed as the situation is dangerous. And so you might say, well, how dangerous is your situation? And the answer is, if you're a street alcoholic who's on the verge of starvation and it's really cold, you should be really stressed because you're barely clinging on to the underside of life. And so your brain is going to produce a lot of cortisol, and it's going to put you in a position of emergency preparation. And the problem with that is that it burns up your physical resources faster than you can replenish them. And so it basically ages you across all the dimensions of aging you could imagine. It makes you more likely to be obese, more likely to develop Alzheimer's, more likely to be depressed, more likely to get cancer, more likely to develop diseases, you name it, because cortisol suppresses immune function, for example. Whereas if you're in a comfortable position and your job is something you've mastered and you have lots of friends and family around you, then your brain is going to notice that pretty much wherever you go, things turn out the way you want them to. And it's going to assume that you're safe, relatively speaking, and that you don't need to be in a state of emergency preparation. Now, imagine that it's a very difficult computational act, and so your mind seems to do something like, imagine that each situation that you've moved through in your life could be considered an element of territory. And then imagine that there's a proportion of territories where things went well compared to where they went badly. Okay, the higher the proportion of things that went badly to things that went well, the more stressed you should be. because it's an index that you failed to master your environment. And the more that you failed to master your environment, the more nervous and agitated and prepared for emergency you should be.
Okay.
Okay. So now when you go back and write about a situation that you didn't master, what you're trying to do is to extract out an account of it that's causally accurate so that you can avoid such circumstances in the future. And then if you do that properly, your brain will think, okay, now you know what to do. We can code that little territory as mastered. And that decreases your overall stress load.
I want to focus on logos here just a minute, because as I was, and I'm looking forward to going through it in my own past and things that have happened to me, I found great solace in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he was coining the phrase logotherapy. Is it possible for someone, when they externalize some traumatic event, say some negative, scary thing that happened to them, and they get it outside themselves, they mind dump it by putting it on paper, or in this case, in the software. Is it possible that those dark times, those times of pain, can paradoxically become sources of insight and greater courage, because you realize it was distressing, but it wasn't dangerous. I'm here, I'm writing about it, and I can move forward with greater strength.
Sure, that is part of what you're doing is, like, let's say that you had a history of being bullied when you were 10. Well, you might be carrying that with you. I mean, you made a comment earlier today about the fact that you sort of reflexively regarded your ability to be at the center of attention as a fault.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so that was a crystallized story, micro story, that you've been carrying built into you all the way along.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tagged part of the manner in which you exist in the world as negative.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you're much older than you were when you developed that micro story, but it hasn't been updated. Now you can write it down and you can think, well, wait a minute. Well, obviously that made me bad at sitting down and shutting up and listening. But why does that constitute a virtue anyways? It does if you're in the classroom where everyone is supposed to sit down and shut up and listen.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not by any stretch of the imagination a reasonable sample of what you might need to move forward in life successfully. The school system was set up to train obedient workers back in the late 1800s. That's why everybody's arrayed in desks in rows, why there's alarm bells that go off. And it was explicitly designed to make people obedient. So really, that's still what we're teaching children to do. I mean, you should be disciplined in all of that. You should be able to follow a planned sequence, but there are very few people who work in 19th century factories anymore. So anyways, you go back into these memories that have been codified in a particular way that leave you with a particular view of the world and a self-representation, and reconsider them and update them. So I had a client once, this is a good example of, because you think the past is fixed and unchanging, but it's not. It's subject to reinterpretation. So I had a client once who came and told me that she had been sexually abused by her older brother.
Mm-hmm.
She was very young. She was about 4. And she was telling me the story and being quite distressed by it. And I had this vision in my imagination of her suffering at the hands of, a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or something like that. But I asked her, okay, well, how old was your brother? And she said 6. She was about 27 when she told me this story. And so I said to her, well, look, one story is that you were sexually abused by your older brother. And a 6-year-old is a lot bigger than a 4-year-old, right? I mean, from a 4-year-old's perspective, a 6-year-old might as well be an adult. But I said, well, maybe you were 2 really badly supervised children. I mean, think about a 6-year-old. And it came as quite a shock to her because she had always conceptualized her older brother as this sort of menacing older force. But she also, as a 27-year-old, knew what 6-year-olds were like. And so you could say, well, it was the same event either way, but that's not exactly true.
Yeah.
So there's got lots of parts of a person that are sort of stuck in the past, and you can tell that roughly speaking, if you remember something that's more than about 18 months old and it causes emotional distress when you remember it, it's as if the part of you is stuck back there in the past. And here's a way of thinking about it. So imagine when you face a threat or something unknown. Okay, you learn from that. Now, what does it mean that you learn? Well, it means that that's a domain of information, and you acquire the information and you rebuild your own interior structures of interpretation out of that information. And you elaborate and update your model of the world. So you turn the anomalous or unexpected experience into a slightly different view of the world and a slightly different personality. Now, if you hit a wall that you couldn't get past, your body signifies that as threatening. And you've been unable to transform that threat into usable information, which it basically means you haven't been able to get the gold from the dragon. It really does mean that. That's what that story means. And so what you're doing is going back to your past and saying, well, where do all the dragons sleep? And is there something I can do to roust them out now and gather the treasure that remains? And so, well, more people worked on Pennebaker's paradigm over the years, and it was basically found that regardless of what you wrote about, as long as it was uncertain, the same curative benefits seem to apply. And so the future is uncertain. You can say the future, the unattended future is a source of continual anxiety. So you want to map it. Okay, then there's another line of research showing that if you get people to write out a plan for their life, not for their job, if they write out a plan for their life, their job performance, their academic performance improves substantially, 10% on average in corporate environments. And in our research, the average has been about 25% for university students. And then we also showed, specifically with the future authoring program, which we'll get to in a moment, that it increases grade point average by about 20% and decreases dropout by about 25%, especially for men, especially for lower performing men or ethnic minority men, for that matter. So the future authoring program asks you to first of all, put yourself in sort of a meditative state of mind, so a daydreaming state of mind. And then to imagine that you were taking care of yourself the way that you would take care of someone you cared about. That's not an easy thing to do because people are often very self-critical, but extend to yourself the same courtesy that you would extend to someone that you cared about. And then ask yourself, okay, 3 to 5 years down the road, what do I want my friendships to look like? What sort of people do I want to be around? What do I want from an intimate relationship? How should my family be constituted? What do I want for my career? What do I want? How am I going to take care of myself mentally and physically? How am I going to cope with the temptations of drug and alcohol use? So you think about that, then you write for 15 minutes about what your future could be like 3 to 5 years down the road if it was the way that would be best for you if you were taking care of yourself. Then you flip that around. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I've got every sentence you say. I've got 9 follow-up questions, but I just want to have you keep on spooling and get to the end a little
I'll
bit.
finish this and then we can have a discussion about it. I'd like to do that. So then you flip the situation around and you think, okay, you have a variety of faults and a set of vengeful thoughts and some arrogance and some desire to make things worse. And everyone knows about that part of them that would go downhill if they let it. So then we ask you to write for 15 minutes about just exactly what kind of hell you could find yourself in 3 to 5 years down the road if you let all your bad habits and resentments and so forth take the upper hand. So then you might say, that gives people something to run away from and something to run towards. And you're sort of maximally motivated. So you might be facing a difficult decision in your life and you think, oh my God, I don't want to go through all the effort it would take to make that change. And then that little hell that you conjured up that you might be heading for will come to mind and you'll think, oh, I better not go there. I better do the difficult thing so I can stay away from that outcome. And the last half of the program asks you to take the positive vision and to articulate why it's valuable. Like what are you aiming for more specifically? Like what are the top 8 goals, let's say? Why would it be good for you if you attained them? Why might it be good for your family? Why might it be good for the broader community? What are the micro steps? What are the obstacles? So partly you do that because you're going to have doubts about your plan. And other people are going to have doubts about it too. And you need to have more reasons for doing it than you have doubts about why you shouldn't do it. And articulation, writing, really, really helps with that. So you can quell those demons in your head that are always trying to undermine your movement forward. You can out-argue them, basically, because smart as you might be, you can probably only come out with about 5 doubts. And so if you have 6 reasons for moving ahead, you win. And you win in a discussion with someone else, too.
So you're propelled from the hell, but you have a heaven, so to speak, just to keep the analogy clean.
Exactly.
You're free from something, and you're free to something.
Exactly.
So, it's interesting you're talking about the virtues and changing your mind about the way certain traits were labeled by others. When I first read into the definition of humility, just a couple of years ago, I always assumed the humility meant, oh, woe is me, I'm just a little worm. I have no gifts and talents, and that's humble. Well, that's actually false humility. Humility is the truth about yourself. No grandiosity, but also no BS about how horrible you are. And it's interesting how we can be ruthless with ourselves in ways that we would never be with someone we cared about. Oh, yeah, that's very common. People almost inevitably have a self-destructive critic in their head. You know, Freud talked about that as the negative part, the tyrannical superego that's just beating you down all the time. And of course, you know your flaws more than anyone else does. Yeah. So you can really go after yourself. I'm sure you've heard of the concept of critics' math. It's a story told by comedian Larry David, the creator of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. He found himself at a Dodgers game. He was in whatever shows how much of a baseball fan I am. Brooklyn, New York, Mets. He's at a Mets game, and someone saw him in the stands, and they showed his face on the Jumbotron, and 30,000 New Yorkers said, Larry, the local boy who went to Hollywood and became hugely successful. And he remembers, he said this in an article in Rolling Stone magazine. He's walking back to his car after, feeling the love of 30,000 New Yorkers for him. And this gang of yahoos drives by him, and they recognize him. They say, Larry David, you suck. So guess which event he ruminated over for weeks, right? The yahoos, completely obliterating a stadium full of palpable affection for him. And I think there's a temptation to do that. So the critic's math is 99 compliments plus 1 criticism equals 1 criticism mentally. Right. Well, part of that too is that, we're wired up basically so that we feel a loss of a certain magnitude more keenly than we feel joy at a gain of the same magnitude. And the reason for that is because we err on the side of caution, right? Something that hurts you can kill you, whereas something that's good for you can just make you happy. So pain hurts more than pleasure feels good. And it's self-protective, but it can really go astray in exactly the manner that you just described. So, and also people also often radically underestimate how much trouble other people are or are in. So they look at themselves and the problems in their life, and they're embarrassed about it. They don't talk about it. And so they think that everyone out who's on the street smiling, which is first only a tiny fraction of the population to begin with, because there's lots of people hiding at home. Yeah. Those people are wandering around and they're completely successful and they don't have a care in the world, which you just have to scratch the surface of someone, generally speaking, to find out that that's the farthest thing from the truth. Yeah. Is part of the success in the self-authoring suite with underperforming men and freshmen generally at the undergrad level, is part of the success rooted in the fact that they begin to pick different friends when they see their own promise. There's a famous phrase by Jim Rohn: "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." Do people recalibrate who do I want to hang out with? Because if
that should happen whenever you make a big transition in your life, right? If you're aiming upward.
You're like the alcoholics don't hang out at the tavern anymore, and they realize half their friendships were just booze bonds, which are no bonds.
Right. It could be all their friendships.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to stop drinking, because you have to stop being with all your friends. It leaves a big hole in your life. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I think we puzzled over why it works better for men a lot. Now, part of the issue is that on average now, men are underperforming women in most academic domains, right from junior high through university. But I think it's this. I think that because men and women have different personalities, men are more disagreeable than women. They're not as compliant. They're not as compassionate. They're not as polite. Although women have higher levels of negative emotion. Men are more, what would you call it, more competitive and more self-determining in a sense. And so that's positive.
More overtly combative.
Yes, exactly. So my sense is that men just won't do anything unless it's their own plan.